when Scream 4 came out in 2011, I kind of wondered, what is the purpose in all this? Why does this movie exist? We had the original Scream, which came out in 1996, and it's fantastic. It's a horror classic. It really plays on a lot of the tropes and conventions of horror films, and Wes Craven really did a great job of kind of like poking fun at a type of film that he helped himself establish with Nightmare on Elm Street, Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, and the movie had this very like meta commentary about the state of horror films, and it came very, very close to breaking the fourth wall. And the sequels have kind of all done the same thing, uh, and really played up the fantastical elements of what is modern horror cinema. And every one of the movies tried to kind of like answer that question in its own way to varying degrees of success, and none did as well as the original in terms of that. So all four of them were directed by Wes Craven, and now we get a reboot slash sequel. This movie is technically Scream 5, just without the actual number. And the movie actually is like smart enough and clever enough to poke fun at that exact thing. It pokes fun at movies that are a sequel without actually having a number in it, knowing full well that this is what the movie itself is doing. And the question is, does this movie need to exist? Right? In 2011, it seems like they wrapped things up pretty cleanly. Wes Craven in subsequent years sadly passed away. And so let's answer that question. What is this all about? Thanks so much for checking out the video. Before we get started, click on that red subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you know whenever I post a new piece of content. So Scream, aka Scream 5, if you want to call it that. This is the fifth Scream film and a direct sequel to Scream 4. It spends a lot of time referencing the first film and maybe a little sprinkling of info about the sequels, but that's basically it. It's a smart, funny when it needs to be, and super engaging horror film. And you can't call the original Scream a modern horror movie because it's really not. So much has changed since the original came out in 1996, and so this movie looks back fondly on that film and like does its best to establish the Scream universe in a modern setting. So let's just put it like that. The last film, Scream 4, tried to do that and kind of failed, spectacularly with like, a character wearing like, essentially like a GoPro around and filming everything. And it kind of captured what it thought the world was going to look like in the future. And it didn't really do a great job of that. And so after that, I didn't really ever see the need for a sequel. And yet this movie comes out and it's awesome. It's extremely gory. It's extremely violent, and the story is really kind of great, all things considered. So let's talk about what I liked. It has really, really, really good performances across the board. Particular standouts, I would say Jenna Ortega, who plays like one of the lead female roles. Melissa Barrera, who plays her sister. She's fantastic in this too. And then David Arquette, who's one of the three main legacy characters returning alongside of Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox. And those three in particular give great performances. And what's nice about it is that they give way the like legacy characters, the Sydney and the Gale and the Dewey, they give way to the newer characters. And the movie spends a lot of time talking about the past, but those characters, only one of them is like super important to the story, I felt like, and it's a smart move. It could have failed spectacularly by spending too much time in the past, and it doesn't do that. It spends the time in the past when it needs to, but it also knows when to spend its time in the present and move forward. So great performances all around, especially from those three particular actors. It doesn't ignore the previous films like at all. It understands that there were 4 movies, but it really leans heavily into the original. There's set pieces that are recreated from the first movie, and the way that's done is really, really cool. It's kind of snuck in there before it's really explained to the audience, and so there's some rad stuff done with that. Yeah, so I love that. The story here, like I said, is really great, focusing on the younger cast, but not at the expense of the legacy characters, works well. And it has just the right balance of both. This is one of those things that's really easy to screw up. I think the Star Wars movies kind of dropped the ball in that regard, but this one gets it right in terms of paying homage and moving things forward. Um, it gets an establishing twist out of the way really, really early. One of the issues with these movies previously, in particular the sequels, is like they drop these like absolute bombs about particular characters on you at the end, and it none of it makes sense. Like the twist at the end of Scream 3 in particular is like egregious. Like the long lost brother twist is just goofy and makes no sense in that film. And they don't do that here. They establish like one of the plot twists really early, and I respect that. In the first like 15 minutes, you know one of the main characters' motivations, and that doesn't mean they are or are not the killer, but it's one less thing you have to think about. And I think the movie's smart for doing that. And it was noticeable to me. So I like that. The movie looks great. It's well shot. The directing duo that does this really knows their way around a camera. The cinematography is great. And along the lines of how it looks, it's violent and gory. And this movie has easily the best kills of all the Scream films. I think I'd say that, including the first one. It's this version of Ghostface is extremely like mean and menacing. And the first 4 films, there's a lot of Ghostface, like running around a house and getting chairs thrown at him and doors slammed in his face. And there's like a couple sequences with that here, but it's never like completely out of control. And he's pretty terrifying in this. He or she is extremely terrifying in this. So I really, really, really like this version of Ghostface. It's terrifying in all the right ways, and I dig it. Yeah, there's some great like shout outs also. There's one particular shout out to Wes Craven. There's a character named Wes. And then the 2 sisters, their last name is Carpenter, which is clear reference to John Carpenter, who directed Halloween. And I dug that. I like those little references and those character moments that reference things that come before. That's something that Carpenter was really good at doing in his films. I mean, he's obviously still around. But like the Halloween reference to The Thing from Another World, which is then a movie that John Carpenter would go on to remake himself. Like, I love those little references to other movies. And that also goes into one thing that is a bit of a challenge with this movie, and that is the like meta narrative. And I don't want to spoil the ending of the movie and the motivation of the killer or killers, but it's kind of goofy. It's a little cringy, and I don't hate it, but I don't love it. And I understand where the direction they go with it. It's a very, very 2022 kind of twist, and I didn't love it. So yeah, and the ending of the film as a result is a little bit messy. Just a little bit. It's very like convenient and wrapped up, and it feels a little rushed for a movie that's just short of 2 hours long. I was kind of surprised that they rushed the ending, but it just feels like they did. Just no way around it. So the twist that I mentioned is also cool, but it's also a bit of a stretch. And I don't know if this is just me watching the film, but or how like the way it was shot or the character reactions, but there was something about that twist and this character's relationship to somebody else that just felt really off to me. And I think it's because they throw it out there so early, and then they do a couple of things that make it feel like they're going to establish more of it, and then they kind of like just disregard it. It's still referenced throughout the film, but there's how can I say this without spoiling it? There's a plot device that they use that they like integrate it pretty heavily in a couple scenes, and then they just completely disregard it and don't revisit it later. And I think they could have handled that a little bit better. They kind of fumble it a little bit, but the other thing is I figured out who the killer or killers is or are really like relatively quickly. So I'm not really good at figuring that stuff out. And the reason I did is because of a lack of explanation on the film's part, particularly a scene that happens and then there's no follow up. And so I was like, oh, this seems really obvious that this person is the killer. And again, I don't want to spoil anything. I really don't like spoiling these types of films because a lot of the fun is to be had in the reveals and the twists. So um, it's not a bomb. They didn't screw it up. I wouldn't say they screwed it up, but overall, this is a great movie. I know it sounds like I'm harping on it a lot at the end because I do have some valid criticisms, but this movie's great. It's easily the best sequel to the original, and despite winking and nodding and basically explaining to the audience that requels and prequels and sequels, like that's all Hollywood does these days, it does a good job of like turning that on its head. And despite the fact that I think this movie was marketed like crap, I remember watching the one trailer and just being like, this looks like the most generic ass, boring modern horror film. I was pleasantly surprised to see how well they did with this. There's one scene in particular that I won't spoil. That's one of my favorite set pieces, and it's in a setting that's really really common in these types of films, like to a fault. In fact, several like there's one particular Scream film that has a massive set piece that's set in the same place, and the way it's done here is just great. It's well filmed. It's got just the right amount of tension. I was on the edge of my seat, and yeah, so I dig this film. This movie's also not afraid to take chances. It knows when it's okay to kill off, maybe a legacy character, and yeah, it's a great sequel. I'm really interested to see what they do with the future of Scream because the original is fantastic. This is easily the best sequel if I was to rank them, which you can check out on my Instagram. I put them on my story. I ranked. I would go the original Scream. I would go this one. So I do a Scream 2022, Scream 2, Scream 4, Scream 3. If I were to have to rank them all, that's probably the order I would go. I think all of them are very, very watchable, even though the sequels are fairly mediocre. But this one's great. Big fan. So it's streaming now. Didn't get a chance to check it out in theaters, but I did watch it streaming. So thank you so much for checking out the review. If you liked it, found it helpful, please consider subscribing. You can also like and share the video. That tells the powers that be that it's worth promoting. So hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you think of Scream. And I'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m.